Hello, my name is Carly Post, and I created a week-long module for high school students regarding controversial issues discussions. And I'll be explaining the ins and outs of this lesson set and how it accommodates critical issues in controversial discussions. The major goals for this module include civic knowledge, civic engagement, and academic engagement. Recognizing that there are some limitations here just because this is a classroom and most students aren't old enough to vote yet. In addition, they probably don't know as much about the issues as they should, having not had as much civic discussion to this point in their academic career. There is substantial research evidence read in the last couple of weeks that supports that civic engagement will improve with the amount of critical issues discussions used as a pedagogical tool by teachers during students' formative years. Dr. Paula McAvoy, for example, addresses this in both her writing and her interview. One of the most major ways I'd like to improve, or at least improve the chances of student civic engagement, is just by increasing their civic knowledge. In this set of lesson plans, I address the controversial issues of immigration as well as standardized testing. Hess and McAvoy do acknowledge that context is a major factor in students' engagement. So this lesson may have greater impact for students for whom immigration is a major issue regionally. But standardized testing is an issue for all students regardless of location or geographical area. So I've tried to select issues that are relevant and that are critical for students. So compounding that with academic engagement hopefully would raise civic engagement in turn. Discussion is known to be a method of teaching that results in high engagement for students, so that civic knowledge combined with academic engagement with different teaching tools and teachers' craft, which I'll discuss later, will hopefully increase student not only engagement but also awareness as well as desire to change things or a call to action. So those are some of the ways that civic engagement could be supported by these goals. I'd like to do a little overview on the essentials of my lesson plans, examining some of the essential questions. With regard to timing and assessment, I've timed this set of lessons, this unit or module, as a 5-day unit, and it could easily be adapted with other controversial issues relevant to students or to hit that context again. It could easily be done close to the beginning of the year, the middle, or the end of the year, but my hope is that it would be useful to teachers toward the beginning of the year so that a lot of these essential questions as well as these points about civic engagement would be repeated and revisited throughout the year. Even though I normally teach elementary school as my day job, I can understand the merits of planning high school lessons with essential questions as well. So I've illustrated this unit with 10 essential questions, and they're all about communicating, they're about controversy, they're about evaluating, decision making, considering bias, and really some of those core democratic principles. I like to think of the essential questions as the overarching goals for the unit. In other words, what are we really trying to teach here? What do we really want students to learn? As I'll discuss later, I'm with Eisner that Popham's objectives can't get us from point A to point B all of the time. So if the goal ultimately is civic engagement, I want to build my essential questions so that I frame the unit around developing that civic engagement, that big idea. On the first day, students will just spend a lot of time defining controversy. They'll work collaboratively to synthesize positions. They'll specify the reasoning for their own position, and then my hope ultimately is that through this lesson they will sympathize with perspective outside of their own. One key pedagogical tool here is that I'll be gathering background knowledge. Hess and McAvoy discuss the importance of gathering students' background knowledge to fuel the discussion. So that's what this first day is all about. That brings me into some of the other best practices used for controversial issues discussions, including considering the evidence at hand for an issue as well as the complexity with multiple sides. I've given this module 2 rounds of discussion because the research supports that it's wise to not leave an issue after one discussion, but to give time for reflection and revisit it. There I'm being informed by some of Parker Palmer's work on leaving space for students to reflect and to synthesize their new learning. Bannister, as well as Cashin and McKnight from the University of Kansas, addressed the issue of Bloom's taxonomy levels of learning, and I've really focused on application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation in this set of lessons, not just knowledge and comprehension. Those are important, but these higher level skills will also help students build a stronger and a more comprehensive foundation for future civic engagement when they encounter critical issues outside of school. And finally, Edelson and Associates address the idea of teacher's craft being a major part of controversial issues discussions. So I've incorporated a lot of what I know to be best practices based on the research and based on my own teaching practice. I've included skills from adaptive schools. There are a lot of collaborative opportunities. There's time for reflection, and there's the use of the stakeholder impact chart, which was specifically Edelson and company, and I'll address that as we go through the lessons. On the second day, we're really exploring bias. I've called it Day 2, Exploring Bias, and I gather again background knowledge on what students know by using a 3-2-1 formative assessment, which will help students to see their own bias as well as the variety of bias within the group. In this lesson, students will need to examine their own bias as well as synthesize new learning about bias with a partner, so that's a collaborative activity as well. For this lesson, I've planned a summary and an examination of Dvorsky's work on the various issues of cognitive bias. I've adapted that into 7 cognitive bias areas that would be especially relevant to high school students. Teachers using critical issues discussions know that it's crucial that we establish norms before discussing, so I've spent an entire day on accountable talk stems as well as discussing effective and ineffective discussions. Students will have the opportunity to respond to what frustrates them, and then they'll be categorizing those results and then thinking about a scenario using the accountable talk stems. That's based on the work of Elham Kazemi, to respond to each other and to share their thinking. Expanding upon Dvorsky's work with cognitive bias areas, I also took into account the Cashin and McKnight advice, again from University of Kansas, which suggests the importance of making sure students understand the complexity of the issues as well as multiple perspectives. This is especially important in the democratic process, as no one ever totally agrees with anyone else. So understanding that there are 2 sides or more than 2 sides to every story, and that each one of those includes several nuances, is highly relevant to a future civic engagement issue for students. They really see in this lesson the complicated nature of forming a position, since they consider the consequences for every one of the stakeholders. This is the lesson where they will complete the chart on stakeholder investment as well. This is where I'll use a lot of artifacts that are recent and relevant to try to really create that context. There's a Pew Research article, there's some data from the census, there's also an NPR article from just 6 months ago about the border wall in Texas. So there are some highly relevant issues for students to consider here. This helps to create a relevant and high investment context that will also help students to deepen their thinking and to consider the perspectives of others. In their work, Edelson and Associates really emphasize the impact of decision-making on multiple parties, and the fact that decision-making can in fact reach very far and be global in nature. So this last day I've spent on reflecting on impact. Here I'm really hoping that students will make connections among the issues and the stakeholders and consequences. They'll again utilize those accountable talking stems. They'll really reflect on not only what they've learned, but how their thinking has changed and how it's changed based on what others have said. And that's incredibly applicable to quote-unquote real life when they understand that when they vote or when they engage in political discussion, they're really engaging in the democratic process. And this is a way that we offer them a truly democratic education. So in addition to understanding the merits of the actual issues of immigration as well as standardized testing, they'll understand the value of discussion in class as well as beyond. So the goals on this last day really pertain not only to content, but also to the process, the methods. And in a lot of ways, that's what the democratic process is really about. It's about not only identifying the issues and the complexity of those issues, but also understanding the social dynamics and how those things impact the ways that people engage. I've discussed that I have adapted Dvorsky's cognitive bias areas for high school students. I've chosen 7 areas that are specifically most relevant to them, in my opinion, as well as wanting students to really understand the impact that their decision making can have. It can in fact be global if they're using it to make an impact from their own thinking. As far as my own role and position goes, the literature suggested to leave most of the discussion to students. When in doubt, stay quiet and hear them out. So I've spent this entire week, theoretically, not injecting my opinion so as to open up space for students to do so. And in this way, adhering to the theories of non-repression, which are so important in a democratic education. During the final day of reflection, I do include an opportunity for me to share my position, but I make it clear that my position is based on my own values, my own bias, my desire to be involved and to what engagement level, and I have the tools I need to justify my position to students. However, this is about their engagement and their learning, not necessarily mine. I've already understood the degree to which I want to be involved in civic issues and in the democratic process, but this is about students learning to what extent they want to be involved. So I've really added it in only as an opportunity to share my response if students ask for it. Although I've written essential questions for this set of lesson plans, I've also written objectives. The first several objectives on each lesson will adhere to Popham's guidelines, so specifically Guideline 1, which states that behaviors must be observable, as well as Guideline 4, which adheres to content generality. Several of the objectives that I've written can be transferable not only across lesson plans or units in like a social studies or a civics class, but also across all classes and subject areas. For example, using collaborative thinking stems and utilizing effective ways of discussion and drawing conclusions from data. All of those are universal learning objectives. However, I definitely identify with Elliot Eisner as well, recognizing the fact that sometimes instruction is too complex and dynamic for us to specify on the outset. So every final objective I've included in every lesson adheres more to this overarching understanding that I want students to gain, to be engaged with, and to hopefully in the future involve themselves in critical issues and the decision making involved there. I also recognize that while my position as a teacher is important, my role as a facilitator is such that I allow the students to expand on their own learning. Again, this is about their learning, this is about their engagement, this is about non-repression. So to some degree, who am I to imagine what they might learn and what they might take away from the lesson beyond what I could imagine? And that's the goal of any teacher's quality instruction. Again, that's another reason for my last day of final reflection. That's why I include a whip around pass at the end where each student says a word or phrase which explains what he or she has learned. I include a lot of external resources in this unit plan to again create that context and solidify foundation for students. I also include both summative and formative assessments. Those are written in green, so they're easily identified. This lesson plan includes a bibliography of all of the works that I've referenced or utilized in my work, as well as hyperlinks to useful materials contained herein. Since I'm an elementary teacher, I was initially nervous to write lesson plans for high schoolers, but this became such an involved project where I really synthesized a lot of ideas, and it makes me wish I was K-12 certified. Well, Almost. Enjoy!